Okay, here is our lecture on Chapter 11, Nutrition, Exercise, and Sport. This is Mary Kate Keys, one of the human nutrition instructors. So this is our sports nutrition lecture. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain the benefits of physical activity. I bet you could already do that. Talk about the energy sources that our muscles use and that elite athletes use to enhance performance or get the best from their muscle. We'll talk about how the body responds to physical activity, again, particularly the elite athletes. We'll talk about designing a diet plan for an athlete, what goes into it, the considerations that are particular to athletes. I'll talk, of course, about fluid needs, what happens if you get too much, what happens if you get too little. I'll talk about the best meals and snacks before, during, and after an athletic event, whether that's an actual game or match or simply a practice, which is also important. And we'll talk a little bit about ergogenic aids. There'll be a few that I'll point out that are important. Ergogenic aids are things that are not diet, that enhance athletic performance. They also may not be legal. So the benefits of exercise, again, a lot of us know, you'd probably know 90% of these already. It can help lower blood pressure. If you've done consistently, it increases your cardiovascular health, it can improve your blood lipid profile, like your cholesterol and triglycerides. It can help in weight management. You can't outrun a bad diet, which I think a trap a lot of people fall into though. Of course, you can increase your muscle mass and your muscle strength and your muscle endurance. It can improve your GI peristalsis, so it can improve the flow of food through your GI tract. So it's something important to remember if you're having some trouble going, maybe a brisk walk could help. It improves sleep, particularly if you're doing your exercising in the morning or early afternoon, not later in the day, because it might actually interfere with sleep time. It can slow the aging process. It can reduce the risk, exercise can reduce the risk of some cancers like colon, prostate, and maybe even breast cancer. It can improve your immune system health if done regularly and consistently and not overdone. So you can overdo exercise and it can actually have a negative effect on your overall health. Regular exercise can increase your flexibility and your balance, reduce stress, and improve your blood glucose control, so you're able to use glucose easier. It upregulates insulin sensitivity. And then, of course, just your bones and your joints get stronger, so not just your muscles. All right, so the physical activity guidelines for Americans outline 3 goals. It says adults should be physically active. That first one's kind of like a gimme, but most US adults are not physically active. And then these guidelines go on to say that each week adults should engage in 150 minutes of moderate intense exercise, and this is aerobic exercise, or 75 minutes of intense exercise. And then the third recommendation is particular to strength training. So it's recommended that individuals strength train at least 2 times a week. So we're not, this is not a class on being a personal trainer or anything like that. So I'm going to go over these a little quickly. Some characteristics of a good fitness program include a bunch of different things. We'll talk about the mode, duration, frequency, intensity, progression, consistency, and variety. So this pyramid I think is really helpful. So it's recommended that US adults exercise most days of the week and are physically active most days of the week. So doing things, these are just activities of daily living. Aerobic exercise 3 to 5 days a week, flexibility 2 to 3 days a week, strength training 2 or 3 days a week, doing fun things that are not things that are taking care of the home, that are not exactly planned exercise at the gym or at home, but things that you enjoy doing: golf, bowling, hiking, rollerblading. And then it's recommended sparingly. We are sedentary, so sparingly watch TV, sparingly sit down. The duration and frequency are how long you're going to do it and how frequently you're going to do something. So frequency recommendations are most days of the week. Whether that can be continuous or broken up doesn't matter. So 10, 30, or 3 10-minute bursts of exercise are as good for you as one 30-minute burst of exercise. And I've already said the dietary guidelines outline a little bit more regarding how physically active to be. It's recommended that most days of the week you're exercising at least 30 minutes a day for disease prevention, 60 minutes a day for weight management, and then if you're trying to lose weight, exercising 90 minutes at a moderate pace to maintain weight loss. Now, these can be big numbers to swallow if you're not an exerciser at all, so a little is better than none. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what our muscles use for energy. So the first thing that's sitting in your muscles right this second is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. There's a tiny pool of adenosine triphosphate in your muscles right now at any given time, ready to be used in almost like in a pinch, in an emergency situation. This energy is only going to last 2 to 4 seconds, which isn't going to get us anywhere. But this is the energy that's just sitting there waiting. Should you need to jump up to catch something, jump up because the fire alarm went off, just get up and go. That's the energy to move. Then that ATP, the phosphate group is snapped off, and now we have adenosine diphosphate. And I think you know this already, but tri is the prefix for 3. So adenosine triphosphate has 3 phosphate groups. Adenosine diphosphate has 2 phosphate groups. So once you snap off a phosphate in those 2 to 4 seconds for the energy you need to jump out of your chair, should there be a fire alarm going off, there's now a DP. You've snapped off 1 phosphate. So the body has a way of using that adenosine diphosphate and phosphocreatine to make a little bit more ATP. And this is the energy that's going to get you a little bit further. So if that ATP that's sitting in your muscles lasts 2 to 4 seconds, that's going to help you jump out of your chair during a fire alarm. The reformed ATP that is made from the ADP and phosphocreatine that's in the muscle will get you enough energy to get down the flight of stairs and out the building, for example. So that's the energy that you're going to need for the next 1 minute. Now, obviously, for any of us who have to walk from the parking lot to our school building, or athletes who need to exercise for 2 or more hours a day, this ATP and ADP and phosphocreatine cycle are not going to be the things that keep us going, but it's important to know. I think of it almost as like this is first gear in a car. So these are, you're not going to get anywhere in first gear if you're driving a manual transmission, but it's going to get you going. A little bit more information on this phosphocreatine. So as soon as ADP forms, after that ATP is broken down after that first 2 to 4 seconds, the concentration builds, and there's an enzyme there that transfers inorganic phosphate group, that's that PI here, from phosphocreatine to ADP to make more ATP. And this is the energy needed for short, powerful bursts. Like I said, to run out of a building should the fire alarm go off. But if we're talking about athletes, for jumping, for a quick lift, not long-term, like a whole weightlifting session, or a really quick sprint to a soccer ball or something. All right, let's talk about the food, how the food actually helps us make the energy that we need. So carbohydrates, this is the major fuel for short-term, high-intensity, and medium-term exercise. So anything from, let's say if you did the walk for hunger, which is a moderate, intense 20-mile walk. Actually, you'll be using fat for that mostly. For short-term, high-intensity, and medium exercise, like a soccer game or a basketball game, we're using mostly carbohydrate. If the physical activity is anaerobic, so there is not enough oxygen available, this is a little intense, but it's kind of cool to recognize what's happening in all of our muscles at all time. We all have glucose, which is the breakdown of carbohydrates. So we all have glucose circulating in our blood. It's allowed into the muscle. And we can snap off 2 ATP for every glucose molecule and produce some pyruvate molecules that will go into the citric acid cycle and really make us a lot of ATP. this will only get us, if there isn't oxygen available in this system, this will only get us about 30 seconds to 2 minutes of energy. So this is if you're playing soccer and you are sprinting for the ball and it's you and somebody else and you really turn up the gas and you are going, 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 you can only maintain that intensity, that anaerobic intensity, for at the most 2 minutes if you're a very well-trained athlete. And even the most well-trained, genetically gifted athlete can't go at that intense pace indefinitely. There's a limit to it. And that's because there's no oxygen in the system to help boost the production of ATP. Now here we are in an aerobic situation. So going back to our soccer game example, when you're not driving for the ball, but you're still doing a lot of running up and down the field, yet you're able to catch your breath enough to maintain enough oxygen in the system. This is aerobic exercise. The examples here are jogging or distance swimming. So the ATP supply is slower, but because there's oxygen there, instead of getting 2 ATP molecules from every molecule of glucose, we're getting up to 30 for every molecule of glucose. It's because we can now rely on the electron transport chain to make a lot more ATP out of our glucose molecules. If you want a refresher on this, you can go through the energy metabolism chapter, chapter 9. All right, so we know this already. Carbohydrates in the body are stored as glycogen. So we store glycogen in our liver and we store glycogen in our muscle. We break this glycogen down when we need a quick source of glucose. So the glycogen that we store in our muscles, think of like your big quads. The glycogen that you store there can be used for events, for games or practices or matches or bursts of energy that are fewer than 30 minutes. That's how much glycogen you can store, up to 30 minutes worth of energy in your big muscles. And this is used to fuel the body. The glycogen that we store in our liver, lasts a little bit longer. We can store more calories in our liver, more calories of glycogen. And we can use this for longer events to maintain our blood sugar levels, our blood glucose levels. If our blood glucose levels get too low, whether we're sitting in our desk or whether we're competing in an event, we can start to feel confused, disoriented, kind of just crummy all over when your blood sugar goes too low, if it goes too far below the healthy range. Once you've used up your glycogen, you've hit the wall, which is the term that a lot of athletes use. You may hear about it around marathon time. When a runner hits the wall, there's nothing left in the tank. The tank in this case is the liver and the muscle. They've run out of glycogen. One of the ways athletes try to prevent hitting the wall, or at least delay hitting the wall, is to actually eat during their event. So you might see a lot of long distance runners drink Gatorade with carbohydrate in it, or take energy gels or energy, I almost said blobs, but they're energy cubes that are full of carbohydrate that prevent the athlete from having to tap into all of their glycogen. If they're getting it orally, they don't need to use what's in their muscles. They can kind of wait and save what's in their muscles for later when they really need it. Now we're going to go on to fat in a second, but this is a nice chart because it kind of breaks down the percent of fuel that an individual is using during an event. So we just talked about carbohydrates. That's this, in this case, it's that like light yellowy orangey color here, that beigey color. So the more intense the exercise, the more you're relying on carbohydrate to make ATP. The more intense the exercise, the more you're relying on carbohydrate to make energy. The less intense the exercise, the more you're relying on fat to provide the energy. So each of these exercises goes up in intensity in theory. A woman walking is certainly not exercising at the same intensity as a woman doing a 200-meter hurdle race. So this hurdler is just going for a really short amount of time and she's using mostly carbohydrate for energy. This walker is going at a moderate pace and she's using mostly fat for her fuel to make her ATP, and then the gamut in between. All right, so let's talk about fat. This is the main fuel that we use when we're at rest. So right now while you're listening to this lecture, unless you're on a treadmill or out for a jog, you're using fat for energy. It's also the energy that is used during prolonged low intensity exercises. And it can account for 50 to 90% of fuel for these low intensity exercises. Depends on the individual, how well trained they are, their genetics, a few variables. This is when I was talking about the walk for hunger, the 20-mile walk that you do all day long. This is when you're relying on fuel for energy. You're not exercising at an intense pace. Of course, you're exhausted at the end, but you're going for hours and hours and hours at a low to moderate pace. The more well-trained a muscle is, so the better trained the athlete is, the better that muscle fiber is at using fat for fuel. And this is important because it saves the glycogen. So if you can save the glycogen to be used later, you delay hitting that wall. So if your muscles are well trained, they're actually very good at saying, you know what, we get some we have some fat here. Let's use this instead of the glycogen that we've stored. We can save that glycogen and use it later. Let's use the fat now. It's a little less efficient. It's a little bit harder for the body to convert this long, energy-dense triglyceride or lipid or fat molecule into ATP. However, most of us have plenty of fat on board that we can convert to energy. And because it's so calorically dense, we get a lot more ATP or a lot more energy out of that molecule, that lipid molecule. We cannot rely on fat to support any short duration, high intensity activity. So again, going back to that soccer example, that last sprint to the ball, you're not using fat for that. You hopefully have been relying on fat for the rest of the soccer match. And at that moment when you need it, to sprint to the ball, you can tap into that glycogen because you haven't used it yet. You've been using other things. So I've already said this, training affects how well your muscles are at using fat for fuel. So some other things that well-trained muscle can do that the average muscle or the average person's muscles cannot do are store more glycogen. So an athlete can actually store a few more hundred calories worth of glycogen in his or her muscle, so that when it's time for that athlete to tap into that glycogen at that last push for the ball or those last few minutes of the game, there's more glycogen available. So in addition to an athlete going to preseason and training to have a stronger cardiovascular system and to have stronger muscles, there's some stuff happening sort of, quote, behind the scenes that the athlete may not even know about. She's actually now increasing her muscles' ability to hold on to glycogen or to store glycogen, so she has a deeper reservoir when the time comes. She can store a little bit more fat in the muscle. So we all know that we store fat in our belly, our hips, our arms. Athletes can actually store a little bit more fat in the muscle, kind of little rivers of fat that they can pack away so that they can tap into that fat when they need it during an event. Their mitochondria are bigger. We're not going to worry about that right now. They also have more myoglobin. So we won't worry about those last two, but that just means that their muscles can use energy a little bit better, and that myoglobin helps them deliver oxygen where they need it faster. So this is sort of a refresher of what I just talked about. So we're always using ATP. At any given time, we have that 2 to 4 seconds of ATP waiting to be used to sort of get us going, that really, really fast burst. For a little bit of an extended burst, we have phosphocreatine available to put another inorganic phosphate group onto ADP after it's been broken down. And this is just another burst of energy. For the examples here are shot put, bench press, high jump. Then we switch to carbohydrate to be used anaerobically, so that's not in the presence of oxygen, or aerobically when we can actually get enough oxygen. Our muscles and liver can store carbohydrate as glycogen, and we can use that for activities that are very high intense, maybe the sprint example that I used before, or exercises. If we have enough oxygen on board, it can be for exercising that lasts 2 minutes to 3 hours or even longer. So depending on how well trained the athlete is. And then we use fat under aerobic conditions only. We store that fat in our muscles and, of course, in our fat cells. And this is for longer distance events, all-day hikes, cycling, ultra marathons, just regular old marathons.